Evening are going to speak in the order that their names appear. I'm just a moderator, so you will not have the benefit of my views on this subject. They're going to speak in that order. I'll just introduce them by school or department. The first speaker, Hassan Munaymini, is a PhD candidate, History Department and Middle Eastern Studies. He's a citizen of Lebanon. The second speaker, Mr. Malik Mufti, is a PhD candidate in the Government Department. He's a citizen of Jordan. The third speaker, Khalid Hilmi, is a PhD candidate, Government Department, citizen of Egypt. The fourth speaker, Nada al-Nashif, is an MPP candidate, Kennedy School. She's a Palestinian from Kuwait. The fifth speaker, Sami Sindi, is an LLM candidate, Harvard Law School. He's a citizen of Saudi Arabia. The panelists are going to speak as individuals, of course, but what they will say will, to some extent, reflect the perspective of the country from which they come. Mr. Munaymini will start with a more general kind of statement, giving an historical overview of the crisis, retrospective background to the crisis. The panel has been co-sponsored by the Kennedy School Arab Society, the Harvard Radcliffe Society of Arab Students, and the Middle East Law Student Association. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. Well, I should say not about 10 minutes, but he or she will speak for 10 minutes. The one possible exception is Munaymini, because he will have to, we might give him 2 more minutes in order to be able to deal adequately with the historical background. After they have spoken, there will be questions from the floor addressed to the speakers. But the people asking questions will have to walk up to the microphones at each end here. But we'll get to that by and by. Mr. Munaymini.
Okay, what I'd like to do is I'd like to try to answer the following question. Why were there widespread support for Iraq in the Arab world? I will attempt to provide an answer at 2 levels. Let's call the first one mechanistic. Let it involve items of causality and logic. And let's call the second level existential, involving worldviews and philosophies of history. I may need, though, to address another question first. Was Iraq supportable? A negative answer would reduce the widespread support that was demonstrated for Iraq to an atavistic guttural reaction. I personally find such a portrayal unsatisfactory. One country invades another, plunders it, loots it, a black and white situation. What shades of gray can be introduced to make Iraq supportable? One is an Iraqi perspective that considers the preemptive war launched against Iran one prosecuted on behalf of all other Gulf states, and therefore resentful of both the lack of an expected post-war support and the perceived arrogance of the rulers of Kuwait in their insistence on interest payments for war-related loans. An extension of that perspective, aware of the military potential of Iraq being a target for the West interested in preserving the status quo in the Gulf and preparing for the demise of the Iraqi leadership through a concerted misinformation campaign along the lines of the most dangerous man in the world. Add to that the grievances over the Rumaila oil field, the perceived insistence of Kuwait, among others, on lower oil prices, both undermining to the Iraqi economy. Another factor would be the Israeli role and its perceived manipulative powers vis-à-vis the West. Also, mixed signals from the US administration. And last, but definitely not least, the distinction between Iraq as a people, an infrastructure, an army, and Iraq as a leadership. at one point, at the beginning of the crisis, one Arab intellectual put forward the worst-case nightmare scenario. Iraq destroyed as an infrastructure, devastated as a society, and Saddam Hussein surviving. Are we there yet? Despite the atrocities the Kuwaiti people were subjected to, the situation is not monochromatic. Many of the considerations, of these considerations that I just listed, depict the Iraqi leadership as a calculating, pragmatic, risk-taking, decision-making body. They do not, however, present any hint as to the nature of the popular support for Iraq demonstrated in virtually every Arab state. In what follows, I will provide some elements to help explain the support. Let us start by noting that in today's one superpower world, this popular support goes against the objective interests of the respective states, and hence, those governments who are able to afford it have adopted a pro-coalition stand, or at least declared their neutrality. The popular support for Iraq can hence be described as resulting from ideology, rather than a response to economic interests, whether this response was calculated or spontaneous. The economic component is obviously present, but not as an ad hoc motion, rather embedded in the ideological formulation. Ideology, for our purposes, can be said to be an assessment of history in order to formulate a plan of action for the future. We need to concern ourselves with history as widely read by an Arab intellectual and popular mainstream. Again, I'm generalizing. I'm not talking about every single Arab. I'm talking about what can be referred to as the mainstream. A new world order. This is how the post-First World War word is understood. A war to end all wars. In the Middle East, however, the new setup amounted to a recipe for the multiple conflicts to follow. It is not my aim here to assess whether the pre-war Middle East was a viable alternative in the post-war era. In all likelihood, it was not. I only need to underline that, whether through a calculated dismemberment or through the idiosyncrasies of French and British imperial histories, the modern Middle East, which was to emerge, was endowed by the colonial powers with the modern nation-state system. By the quasi-arbitrary nature of the new system, it disrupted numerous established patterns, whether political, economic, social, or cultural, and was therefore bound to be faced with opposition. I'd like to dwell a bit more about this system. With the exception of a few localized elites, virtually all social and political groups had reasons to resist the new system. I'm talking basically about the boundaries, about the states as we know them today. The urban mercantile elites, for example, had their hinterland markets severed. The communitarian elites often faced drastic amputations of their base, and the nationalistic aspirations of many Arab, but also Kurdish, Armenian, and Assyrian intellectuals were simply bypassed. I mean, they were not taken into consideration in the formulation of the new nation-state system. Practically every single nation-state newly created had elements of instability in it, whether active or latent. Now, I should underline that it is not the internal heterogeneity of these nation-states in terms of language, ethnicity, or culture that makes them necessarily unstable, but, arguably, the sudden and almost random entrapment of many centers of powers within the new borders. So new arrangements had to be made to be tested between these now rival centers. Okay? That was not always done, meaning the arrangements. And when it was done, it was not always successful. So ethnic, religious, and linguistic mobilizations, in some we can call it communitarian, was and still is a convenient insurance policy for the elites, for these centers of power, so to say. Early on, a nationalistic political reaction to this new reality, the reality of division, was formulated, and it was adopted widely across the political and social spectra. It is important to note the dynamic nature of this formulation. It is nationalistic in the sense that it insists on Arab unity, it insists on rejecting certain forms of colonialism, but it has a dynamic nature. In the immediate aftermath of the establishment of the nation-state system, the nationalist political agenda was to dissolve the newly formed states. Gradually, though, the Unity Now slogan evolved from a unitarian flavor to sometimes a unity with diversity flavor. It is important to note the explicit, pragmatic, but still within the ideological frame, nature of this dynamic process. Another very relevant demonstration of the dynamic formulation is the attitude towards Israel, for example. Israel. In 1948, Israel was understood as a colonial settler enterprise which needs to be reversed. Basically, kick the colonial settlers out. That was the perception at the time. By the 80s, though, the coming into being of an indigenous Israeli society led to a re-evaluation of the original position. So the recognition of the political rights of the Israeli society, and we're not talking here about some theoretical, mystical right to exist or not. We're talking about the political rights of an Israeli society which exists, albeit within the context of an assertion of the political and social rights of the people who are the victims of the creation of Israel, namely the Palestinians, was therefore formulated. It is my contention that the popular support for Iraq draws on the basic components of the nationalistic political formulation. We can identify three major assertions. One, the assertion that the modern nation-state system is an artificial colonial imposition. In its most recent versions, this assertion does not deny the historicity of institutions claimed to be inherited by today's nation-states, such as, for example, the Imara in Lebanon or the Mashyacha of Al-Sabah in Kuwait. It tries instead to deflate them back to their perceived reality, namely that of functional administrative institutions with no implied nationalistic connotations. I mean, just to make a parallel, imagine a Bostonian republic in some future trying to derive its legitimacy from the Flynn era. This is how the national discourse tried to portray these previous experiences. This assertion does not deny the evolution of these initially artificial nation-states, states like Jordan, Lebanon, etc., into stable frames of national identity. It does not deny the development of internal economic, social, and cultural cycles within them and the establishment of patterns of linkage between these nation-states. Their sustained viability is best demonstrated by the survival of Lebanon as an idea, despite its structural liquidation in the course of the continuing crisis. Lebanon is still valid in the sense that people feel Lebanese, despite the fact that for all practical purposes, there's no such thing as a one Lebanon. The second assertion that I should mention is that the modern nation-state system is an obstacle to growth and development. This system yields situations of extreme economic imbalance, restricting natural wealth in underpopulated states, the elites of which choose to redirect it to a more stable West, and leaving overpopulated states with little potential to combat rampant poverty. Also, the system makes it possible for external powers to erode even the physical setting. I do not mean the mountains, but rather the borders, with little concerted opposition. Hence, for example, in the past, the Turkish control of the Alexandretta district and, obviously, the survival of what was perceived as a colonial settler enterprise in Palestine. The system also, and its above-mentioned corollaries, make it possible for local elites, through alliances with external powers or through their own networks, to exert a firm control over a segmented and institutionally weak population. Okay? The third assertion is that the West and its regional extension, meaning Israel, are inhibitors of the integration of the Arab nation-states and the emergence of non-subdued centers of power. So these three components seem to me to be at the core of the nationalistic formulation of the nature of the crisis in the Middle East. These items, therefore, I argue, account for the mechanistic level of our question. Why, meaning immediate causality. How was the causality that links these assertions to actual action made to function is arguably a function of two agents. We have, on the one hand, spontaneous manifestations, and on the other, a triggered response, meaning a response to something triggered by the Iraqi regime. Again, even when we refer to spontaneous manifestations, the fact that local groups with variable agendas tapped into the spontaneous reaction and occasionally enhanced it should not be neglected, but also should not be overstated. The triggered response is the one designed by Iraq to exert pressure on the respective governments. Now we are ready to attempt, briefly, an answer for the existential level of our question. Why was there widespread support for Iraq? The answer might be in the fact that despite its demise in Arab intellectual circles, this nationalistic agenda has not been dismissed by substantial segments of the Arab population. What this support is symptomatic of might be a vacancy. No political movement seems capable today of inframing and sharpening the nationalistic formulation. No political movement has been able to strike an adequate balance between the reality of the nation-state system and an integration which seems to be still desired. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Namni. The next speaker is Mr. Malik Mufti, Government Department, citizen of Jordan.
One of Saddam Hussein's many miscalculations during the Gulf crisis was his belief that in an all-out military confrontation, enough Arab states would be driven by the pan-Arab sentiments of their populations to come to his side and thereby deprive the United States of its coalition cover. The famous Arab Street failed to materialize, however, and the coalition held. 8 Arab governments sent their troops to wage war against Iraq, while the rest maintained a strictly neutral official stance, agreeing to abide by UN sanctions while mouthing vague platitudes about the need for a peaceful solution. Above all, it quickly became clear that instead of one pan-Arab political outlook, there are 20 Arab states, each pursuing its own particular interest. Instead of one Arab street, there are 20. Here I would like to make a few tentative suggestions about why this was so. In general, it seems to me the position adopted by each country during the crisis arose from the interaction of 2 imperatives. First, the cold, hard, pragmatic geopolitical interests of each country, as understood by its government. And second, public sentiment in that country, the street. On the governmental level, the logic of state interests played itself out flawlessly, with no surprises whatsoever. Every country whose national security was threatened by Iraq's invasion actively joined the coalition against it and dispatched troops to fight it. Kuwait most directly, of course. Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states who feared further Iraqi expansionism southwards. Syria, Iraq's bitter nemesis for many years. And Egypt, Iraq's traditional rival for hegemony over the Arab Middle East. On the other side, those Arab countries whose national interests were served by the preservation of a strong Iraq to counterbalance more immediate threats tended to be more sympathetic to Iraq and tried to help it find a way out of the crisis without being humiliated or destroyed. In this camp was Jordan, whose greatest security concerns lie west and north, and not east across the 500 miles of desert that separate Amman and Baghdad. In this camp also were Yemen, fearful of Saudi hegemony, Sudan, fearful of the Egyptians, and the Lebanese Maronites, fearful of Syria. Countries further away in North Africa had little direct strategic stake in the conflict, and therefore either adopted a strictly neutral position, as was the case with Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, or tried to reap some benefits by tilting towards the side likely to win, such as Morocco, which sent troops to join the coalition. On the street level, too, there were variations. All other things equal, Arab public opinion everywhere is likely to support an Arab country facing a coalition led by the United States, Britain, and France. But all other things are never equal, of course. In Kuwait most of all, but in the other GCC countries as well, the fear of coming under Saddam's rule obviously outweighed any pan-Arab considerations. In Egypt also, the war appears to have been on the whole a popular one. This was due to a strong sense of Egyptian patriotism coupled with widespread revulsion at the treatment of Egyptian workers in Iraq, as I think Khalid will explain in his presentation. In all of these countries, public opinion and state interest coincided to produce a very determined stand against Saddam. There is no way of knowing what popular opinion in Syria is, because it is not an open society. Reports of pro-Iraqi demonstrations early in the fall have not been confirmed, and no new reports of this nature have emerged since then. All that can safely be said at this point is that opposition to Syria's participation in the coalition was not strong enough to have any impact on government policy. Then there is popular opinion in North Africa. Far removed from the scene of the conflict and therefore with no real stake in it, sympathy for Iraq against the American-led coalition was the prevailing sentiment. This sentiment was further fueled by opposition parties that sought to mobilize public support in their favor. The governments of these countries, however, avoided antagonizing both the international coalition and domestic public opinion by adhering to a position of neutrality and calling for a peaceful solution. This was true even of Morocco, which, realizing it had gone too far by sending troops to the Gulf, effectively pulled out of the military coalition. The result was a series of large and noisy demonstrations across North Africa that posed no real threat to the governments of the region and were in turn tolerated by them. The actual impact of these demonstrations on the course of the Gulf conflict was zero. That leaves a handful of countries, Jordan, Yemen, and Sudan, with a real stake in the crisis where both the state and the public tilted towards Iraq. For reasons I have alluded to, each of these countries had an interest in the preservation of a strong Iraq. Yet there is some evidence that as the conflict progressed and Iraq's military defeat grew increasingly likely, Sudan, and to a lesser extent Yemen, began to move to a more neutral position. In Jordan, however, no such shift took place, and if anything, the government's pro-Iraqi stance intensified towards the end. The main reason for this, of course, was the strength of popular sentiment that constrained King Hussein's ability to move away from Iraq, but at the same time may have created new opportunities for him. It is not very surprising that Jordanians should have sympathy for the plight of the Iraqi people, with whom they have had extensive social and commercial ties for a long time now. Nor is it surprising that Saddam Hussein's anti-Israeli rhetoric should have resonated strongly in a population so intimately acquainted with the depredations of the Israeli occupation in Palestine. What is surprising, however, is the extent to which Jordanians identified with the person of Saddam Hussein himself, and were willing to believe even the wildest claims coming out of Baghdad, that Saddam had the arsenal to burn half of Israel, that his occupation of Kuwait was a prelude to the military liberation of Palestine, that his army would be able to defeat the coalition, and even after the war was over, that Saddam had somehow won a brilliant victory. Part of the blame must lie with the Jordanian government. For 10 years now, it has allowed Jordan's television, radio, and print media to become mouthpieces for Saddam's propaganda machine. Saddam Hussein's image as an infallible hero of pan-Arab nationalism had therefore reached mythic proportions. But even more, the blame lies with Jordan's intellectuals, who failed utterly and consistently to make objective and realistic assessments of the situation and to convey those assessments truthfully to the Jordanian people. Had they done so, public opinion would very likely still have supported a pro-Iraqi stance, but it might have been a more sophisticated and nuanced support, one that distinguished between the regime and the people of Iraq. And at the very least, Jordanians would have been better prepared for the catastrophic defeat of Saddam's army and for the popular revolution that has come in its wake. But it was not to be. Jordan's intelligentsia chose to cast reason to the winds and appealed instead to the most atavistic impulses in society. Why they did so, I must confess, I do not fully understand. Frustration at the past and present injustices outlined by Hassan is surely part of the answer. But this might explain the sympathies of Jordanian intellectuals and not so much their analytic failure. In any case, it seems to me, before quickly sweeping the problem under the rug with explanations and rationalizations, we Jordanians need to face up to and acknowledge the magnitude of the failure. Day after day, an army of journalists and commentators, politicians, military analysts, social scientists filled the airwaves and the print media with the most fantastic conspiracy theories, coupled with wildly unrealistic predictions. As a result, a climate of xenophobia and intellectual terrorism was created in which any deviation from official Iraqi dogma came to be viewed as a sign of treason. Public discourse became degraded and vulgarized. At a time in human history when people from Czechoslovakia to Burma are calling out for freedom and democracy, the intellectuals of Amman chant, "Chemicals, chemicals, O Saddam." This moral and intellectual bankruptcy reached its culminating manifestation in a demonstration by university faculty members shown on television here. Deans and professors, bedecked in their academic gowns and mortarboards, marching down the street, carrying banners that read, "Death to foreigners." Such is the state of the academy in Jordan today. Too much passion in politics is always dangerous. In a fragile young polity such as Jordan's, it can be fatal. I said earlier that while public opinion constrained King Hussein's actions throughout the crisis, they may also have created new opportunities for future action. If the popular credit he has earned leaves him in a strong enough position at home, then perhaps he can take part with renewed vigor in the current attempts to find an Arab-Israeli peace settlement. Such a settlement is necessary not only because it would finally bring a measure of justice to the Palestinian people, but also because it would remove a major source of the kind of extremist passion that has made Jordan's first experiment in free public debate such an inauspicious one.
Thank you, Mr. Mufti. Thank you also for confining yourself to 10 minutes. The next speaker is Khalid Helmi, PhD candidate, Government Department, citizen of Egypt.
I have quite a bit to say, so I'll try to speak as quickly as possible. By contrast to the Egyptian government's position regarding the Gulf crisis, little is known about the Egyptian mainstream public opinion. The aim of this talk then is to shed light on the mainstream Egyptian public opinion, which I will argue has been very supportive of the government's position in the Gulf crisis. The margins will also be discussed, the margins deviating from that mainstream. The importance of this examination will be to put in question the notion of the Arab street. All too often references are made in the Western as well as the Arab media to the Arab street. Politicians, intellectuals, even Middle East experts refer to the Arab street very liberally, suggesting uniformity of thought and sentiment. The Egyptian case suggests the need to dispel the myth of the Arab street, Egypt being a large component of the Arab street, being the most populous Arab country with 57 million people. Further, the importance of the Egyptian case stems from the fact that Egypt is one of the several Arab countries which have experienced a liberalization of the political systems. Yet, unlike the other systems which are experiencing the same process, such as Jordan, Algeria, and Yemen, Egypt has a position which is not sympathetic to Iraq. In the other cases, it has been argued that the relative openness of the systems suggests that the government's positions are informed by popular sentiments. The question then arises as to whether this is true of Egypt also. My argument will be that it is the case in Egypt, that there is a convergence between the Egyptian government's position and the Egyptian public opinion in the mainstream. Methodologically, the problem facing any study of public opinion in the Middle East has to grapple with the lack of opinion polls and popularity ratings of governments in the countries of the Middle East. I have tried to circumvent the problem by gauging public opinion from two angles. First, through a consideration of the interests of the Egyptian people who were hurt as a result of the invasion of Kuwait, and more generally were hurt at the hands of the Iraqi regime in Iraq. And secondly, through an examination of the attempts of the Egyptian opposition political parties to address those interests, and in a general attempt to attune the party's position to the public's concerns. The analysis was based on an examination of the political stance of the various political parties at various stages of the conflict, together with a focus on the opposition and official newspapers and magazines and radio reports. When discussing the interests of Egyptian people which are at stake in the Gulf crisis, the expatriate Egyptian worker problem emerges in high relief. One of the largest expatriate worker exporters in the Arab world, Egypt, has close to 1 million citizens working in Iraq, 250,000 in Kuwait, and around 1 million in Saudi Arabia. The workers in Iraq should be the starting point for any discussion of the Egyptian sentiments regarding the Gulf crisis. Egypt and Iraq, almost a year before the Gulf crisis, have experienced tensions with respect to the issue of expatriate Egyptian workers. In 1989, the demobilized Iraqi troops coming back from the front at the end of the Iran-Iraq war were faced with a work market in which Egyptians figured as foreign competition. Harassments of Egyptians followed, involving unwarranted expulsions from work, deportations, beatings, quite importantly, restrictions upon the withdrawal of savings deposited in Iraqi banks. What struck the most emotional chord, however, among the Egyptians was the unexplained killing, the phenomenon of unexplained killings of Egyptian workers in Iraq. There were 800 killings of people usually returned to Egypt in coffins with or without a death certificate. If there is one, it would say things like death, vague reference to death by asphyxiation, knifing, shooting, burning, etc. This, for Egyptians, was a prelude to what was to come in August 2nd. The invasion of Kuwait in August, with the coming of that crisis, most of the Egyptians in Iraq and naturally in Kuwait had to leave, losing income and possessions, leaving them behind. Adding to the financial damage of that segment and their dependence in Egypt, the rest of the population in Egypt was to experience the impact through the overburdening of the infrastructure, with all the Egyptians returning back in the thousands. Finally, a considerable segment of Egyptians whose livelihood depends on tourism were also hurt as a result of the invasion and its aftermath. Now, this leaves us with a picture of some estimated 5 to 6 million Egyptians who suffered economically in the most direct way as a result of the invasion. This number covers various socioeconomic strata ranging from the upper middle class professional university professor who worked in Kuwait to the impoverished, unskilled, illiterate peasant who worked the fields in Iraq. It is in the context of this core of sentiments that the Egyptian position regarding the Iraqi invasion is to be understood. The economic damage, and quite as importantly, the tales of atrocities which were related by all the Egyptians coming back from Kuwait, atrocities which are a kind of larger scale parallel of what the Egyptians had experienced in Iraq. Having said this, I want to move to an examination of the positions of the political parties in Egypt regarding the Gulf crisis. In speaking of these positions, two components stand out which make the positions. First, the condemnation of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and second, the concerns about the foreign presence of Western troops in the region. The relative emphasis given to these two components makes the difference between the positions of the various parties. The political right, the new Waft party, puts the invasion of Kuwait as the paramount problem, emphasizing that it is the cause of the presence of foreign troops, and emphasizing that neither the Egyptians nor any other people have the right to tell the Saudis or Kuwaitis not to resort to foreign troops to help defend the sovereignty of the nations. On the other extreme, the fundamentalist Muslim Brothers and the leftists were the ones to emphasize the presence of foreign troops as the most pertinent danger, and hence downplay some of the invasion question. It is important to, at this stage, discuss how the interests discussed before of the Egyptians hurt in Iraq and Kuwait are rendered in the positions of the various parties. The right, and of course I'm overgeneralizing here, speaking of right and left and fundamentalists, there are subtle shades. The political right presents the strong link between a strong focus on the labor problem, championing the problem of the workers, and the condemnation of the invasion. These two are closely linked in the position of the right. The Waft party represents championing of the labor problem, actually criticizing the Egyptian government for its lack of initiative in enabling those workers to secure their rights. So in some sense, the position of the right, although it converges with the government in its support of the war effort, it is in fact doing so from a perspective which is very, very critical of the Egyptian government. More importantly, the emphasis of the right on the atrocities is quite emphatically framed within a general argument for the promotion of democracy in Egypt. In fighting the opposition, the oppression inflicted by the dictatorial regime in Iraq, the rightist opposition is sending a strong message to the Egyptian government, a message pushing for more freedoms at home and consolidating those which have been already achieved. Consciously, there is also a very strong effort to revive the images of past atrocities, similar atrocities in Egyptian history, and cast those as this is the past that we would never want to see again. Discussing the fundamentalists and the leftists, then we see that there is a larger emphasis on the Western presence, which generally implies lowering the focus on the invasion problem and the atrocities. This results in an often perceived suggestion of condoning the invasion. This is best evidenced by public debate which was stirred as a result of a Muslim Brothers leader declaring that he would rather have Kuwait occupied for 20 years than be liberated by the Americans. People who called themselves Islamists, roughly meaning fundamentalists, stood out against this, some of them former members of the Muslim Brothers, stating their opposition to this on an Islamic basis, that this is un-Islamic, condoning the atrocities, etc. A similar fate was to meet the leftist parties. as evidenced by an article written in an opposition leftist newspaper in which the leader of the party makes reference to a story of his reception of Egyptian Jordanians, Egyptian workers coming from Jordan, from Iraq and Kuwait through Jordan, who make the statement that they consider his parties to be treacherous to the Egyptian patriotic spirit as a result of their a few leaders of the parties have gone to Iraq, made statements supportive of Iraq in the name of the Egyptian people. His article is in some sense an apology, a public apology for that position. He is saying that my party's position is actually condemnation of the U.S. presence, a condemnation of the invasion, and there is no sense of condoning. He goes extensively to describe the atrocities described to him by those people. Okay. Finally, okay, I'll have to cut on. Okay, having said this, let me move to a very brief discussion to the university students' demonstrations which occurred in Cairo University February 24th through the 28th. I would argue that these demonstrations, if anything, actually demonstrate, prove my argument. This is the exception that proves the rule. The timing is very crucial. The timing of these demonstrations having occurred on the 24th. Universities opened in September. During the entire first term, nothing happened, no university unrest took place. The air campaign phase of the war roughly coincided with the mid-year recess. Classes resumed on the 9th of February. Yet it took 2 weeks before demonstrations broke out. The timing was exactly the beginning of the ground war. As a result, it is very clear that this was the time when it was perceived that the concern about the Western influence would be the strongest. And hence, the assumption was that this would be the time when the Egyptian public would be most receptive to such an anti-war statement. So I guess I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Helmi. The next speaker is Nada Al-Nashif, MPP candidate, Palestinian from Kuwait.
I suppose this sounds like one of the more schizophrenic positions on this panel, but I am a Palestinian born and raised in Kuwait. I was there during the invasion. I was there on August 2 and stayed for 8 weeks, after which I came back to start term here. And contrary to the previous presentations, I think this is going to be much more impressionistic, and I wish to share with you a series of concerns that I have both as an Arab as a Palestinian. What needs explanation, what hasn't been covered so far, is the reaction of the Palestinian community inside Kuwait. We were informed of the invasion, ironically, by a phone call from the United States that morning. We had no idea that it had happened. It took a full 3 days for us to realize that we were actually being invaded, that the government had departed. And from then on, there were like 3 weeks of total confusion. Certainly ideologically. The Palestinian community was split from the beginning. Saddam Hussein rode in on a wave of, before the nationalism, certainly toting the unity flag, promising Palestinians inside Kuwait a whole lot of benefits that they had been previously systematically denied, I think it's fair to say. He promised the nationalization of schools. He promised equal opportunity for jobs, equal pay for equal work, slogans that were very effective amongst a very disenfranchised community that had been systematically excluded. Those of us who had the luxury of being able to detach ourselves for a while were very skeptical. His personal record in humanitarian issues and the means by which he entered Kuwait, the whole notion of acquiring land by force as Palestinians was very abhorrent. And I think from August 2 we were torn morally and intellectually. We were placed in a state of crisis. The PLO officially condemned the invasion as early as 2 days later. What they then refused to do was join a collective condemnation on behalf of the Arab League in the hope, I believe, that they would stay a natural mediator and a facilitator of a movement towards a settlement that was peaceful outside the boundaries of war. Certainly the Palestinians who were carried away by the immediate euphoria, the promise of some sort of self-realization in the context of a new world order in the Arab world even, the euphoria wore off very quickly. Within the 4 to 8 weeks that I was there, I saw the disappointment set in as we realized that there was no liberation going to come by this particular mean, and the road to Jerusalem would not run through Kuwait. I think the sentiment, whether it was in the West Bank, Gaza, or on any one of the Arab streets that were pro-Saddam, were not intrinsically pro-Saddam Hussein or anti-Kuwait by any stretch of the imagination. On one level, they were a reflection of a popular disillusion with the status quo in the Arab world. The inconsistencies of inter- and intra-country wealth and income that have long rankled lower income with higher income countries. More explicitly, they were an indictment of foreign intervention and its aims, and particularly to underscore the lack of U.S. moral credibility in the region. As a Palestinian, it's very hard to grow up and not become an advocate of conspiracy theory. I think that was clear from the beginning. As an Arab, my concerns are with our future as a nation. Saddam Hussein, for better or for worse, highlighted the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy in the region. The rush to implement anti-Iraq Security Council resolutions, even while the multitudes of initiatives on the Palestinian issue were ignored and actively fought by the American administrations. The hypocrisy of actively encouraging democratization in previous years and yet choosing to censure the most democratic countries. I mean, for example, Jordan, Algeria, Yemen, even while the United States allied with possibly the most regressive regimes in the area to restore democracy to the region. I am concerned by the long-term implications of U.S. presence in the Middle East, by the physical destruction of infrastructure in Iraq, by the scale of human sufferings, and by our setback in development due to the disproportionate scale of retaliation. I am very worried by the new popular indulgence in a menacing fratricide and fears of bloody civil war, both in Iraq and Kuwait. And I am very distressed, being in this country, by the backlash of anti-Arab racism here. The resurgence of the equations, Arab equals Muslim equals emotional equals fundamentalist equals irrational, is very disturbing. As a Palestinian raised on the twin dreams of Palestinian nationalism and pan-Arabist unity, I am left grappling with the reality of yet another diaspora. The effect of mass expulsion from the Gulf and the changing dynamics of the region have meant that once again we are dispossessed. My mother went through this in 48 and 67. A whole generation was evacuated from Lebanon, and a new reality, I think, is at our hands now. Certainly what's happening now in Kuwait in the last few days, the reports of conflict between Palestinians and Kuwaitis have not allayed any of our fears regarding the future. The linkage between the Gulf crisis and the status of the territories has been inevitable. The Israeli authorities recognized it implicitly when they clamped a 24-hour curfew on the territories with the outbreak of war. The exploitation of this situation, yet again, underscores the vulnerability of the Palestinian population and thus of regional peace. On a more positive note, and again, this is a series of impressions and I hope to answer your questions, maybe there is some light at the end of the tunnel. It's possible that this crisis can be seen as a catalyst, and there are some windows of opportunity and the potential room for reform. In Kuwait, certainly, from early on in the invasion, the opposition had met with the government. The promise of return to parliamentary practices, including the extension of voting rights to women, to the degree that internal conflicts have been started now between the royal family and the opposition, have been symptoms of a very constrained popular expression. We hope that that change will come about, not as a result of Mr. Baker's admonitions to the Gulf rulers, but as, I hope, a true commitment to a more democratic form of government evolves in that area. As a Palestinian, it is perhaps possible that the crisis has pushed this persistently neglected set of injustices to the foreground. Our hope is now perhaps in a convergence of Western initiatives, a European determination to settle this while we can, led by the likes of President Mitterrand, a UN effort to regain some leadership and stature and credibility in the region, independently of the United States, and with luck, a commitment by President Bush to address the major grievance of the area. I think this should be highlighted and set against the stark fact for Israel that its only security will not come from brute military strength or fortified boundaries or powerful allies, but from a peaceful settlement with us, the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Nada. Next speaker is Mr. Sami Sindi, LLM candidate, Harvard Law School, citizen of Saudi Arabia.
Right. In this brief talk, I'll try to sort of explain why the Saudi government invited the American troops into Saudi Arabia and what was the popular feeling of the presence, the military presence, and maybe shed some light on what are the views of pan-Arabism in Saudi Arabia on the popular and government level. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the subsequent hesitation amongst the members of the Arab League to collectively condemn this invasion, coupled with the continuously increasing Iraqi military presence in Kuwait, and especially along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, prompted the Saudi government to invite the presence of American troops on Saudi soil. Following this move, the Saudis and the other Gulf states were accused of siding with imperialist powers in destroying pan-Arabism, and slogans denouncing these countries flourished among some of the Arab masses. Such slogans were also to be found in Saddam Hussein's endless speeches, where he wrongly and confusingly preached pan-Arab objectives and Islamic objectives interchangeably as if they are one and the same, which they clearly are not. I think it is noteworthy to point out here the irony of Saddam Hussein's preaching of Islamic ideals when the very act and nature of Iraq's invasion is in direct conflict with Islamic principles. Turning to the Saudi perspective, the invitation of American troops and eventually Allied troops was viewed differently. The Iraqi invasion and military occupation of Kuwait posed an imminent threat to Saudi national security, and given the nature of the Arab League's reaction to the crisis, Saudi Arabia saw no alternative but to seek the assistance of the United States, which was subsequently joined by other nations, including some Arab nations. At this point, Saudi popular feelings, they were uneasy about the fact that they would be fighting against Muslim brothers, Arab brothers. However, at this point, they saw a conflict between their national interests, and they actually, wrongly or rightly, made a divorce between Saddam Hussein and the idea of pan-Arabism. At any rate, this did not mean that Saudi Arabia rejected Arab unity altogether, or that it would do so in the future, for there are definite political and economic interests to be served in having some form of unity. The question here is, what form of unity should we have? I believe the starting point is to recognize the fact that despite the historical claims of artificiality of the modern Arab states, regionalism and statehood today is a reality and should be treated as a fait accompli. The Arab states have long recognized each other's sovereignty since the formation of the Arab League of Nations. In fact, at the end of in the late 1940s, Mustafa Nahas Pasha, who was then Prime Minister in Egypt, shuttled around different Arab countries to see what sort of unity could be made in the situation, and he came up with the conclusion that any form of unity that can arise should actually take into account the sovereignty of each Arab nation. Having recognized this, we must realize that although the fact that we speak the same language and to a certain extent share the same culture makes a good foundation for unity of objectives, it does not per se give rise to duties and obligations. Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states have to date been distributing large amounts of money using different methods to the rest of the Arab world. Such distributions have been made because it served its national interest to do so. Although the idea of Arabism was one of the motives, it was not the decisive one. The fact that pan-Arabism is not the dominating theme in Arab politics can be seen in the recent history of the Middle East. For instance, one of the central issues in Arab nationalism is the Arab-Israeli issue. Well, we saw in the 70s when Egypt realized that there's no way it could actually be the leader of the Arab unity, and maybe even saw there's no cause, there's no way that Arab unity can be achieved per se, went ahead and sought its national interest by making the peace treaty, the Camp David Treaty with Israel. Similarly, even in Saudi Arabia, when during 1973 war, when there was the oil embargo, Saudi Arabia, on the government level, the rhetoric was not Arab nationalism; it was more in the form of jihad. King Faisal strictly said that this was jihad, which is holy war, which is more Islamic feeling rather than pan-Arab feeling. Although the pan-Arab feeling was there, it was not the dominant force. Similarly, even on the popular level, people spoke of the liberation of Jerusalem as the third holiest shrine in Islam, rather than, although it constituted an important facet, which is, liberation of our Arab brothers, that was not, again, the decisive issue. And even at that point, Jordan, in 1958, invited English troops because it served its national interest to avoid a coup attempt, or a supposed coup attempt. Actually, the ironical issue over here is that King Hussein of Jordan, who is today one of the strongest opposers to presence of American or British or Allied troops, foreign intervention in Arab soil, was the person who actually invited the British troops in 1958. And the very same local press that condemned the English, American and English presence today, actually said, quote, "Every foreign soldier who lands in Jordan under the UN Charter is a UN representative and no longer a national of his state." This must have been forgotten today. Hence, I would like to stress that although Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states are rich in terms of oil, they are in need of, that is basically one of their only resources. We are short in manpower, we are short in agriculture, we are short in water, we are short in many different areas. And as such, I think there are strict interests to be served by having some form of unity, but that sort of unity has to be worked out between the nations and put down in terms of duties and obligations, strict duties and obligations. A lot of people accuse the Gulf states of not distributing their wealth around the different Arab countries. First of all, I would like to point out that the word distribution is not, I would prefer to, is not the correct word, because there has been a lot of distribution. Maybe the word that should be talked about is redistribution. And redistribution can only happen if there is a sort of system which has mutual interests to all parties. A sort of system which leads a country like United Kingdom to undermine its sovereignty and join the European community because there are mutual interests. It is giving, but it is receiving. And any state, and unfortunately this is not only to the Gulf states, but this is human nature and the nature of any country, sovereign state, is that it will not give if it is not going to be receiving anything in return. And So I would like to stress at this point that I think what is needed is not just simply to have an Arab League of Nations, which puts out very general articles saying that we need to reconcile our political and economic activities, and stopping at that. We should get down, the states should sit down together, work out what their mutual interests are, which they are clearly there for. Saudi Arabia did not give, or any of the other Gulf states did not distribute all this wealth to other countries for the sole sake of Arabism, to work out what these interests are, and then to put them down on paper, and put them down very accurately, so that if any country does not meet its duties and obligations, one at that point can point the finger and say you have not been doing your duty. However, as it stands today, you cannot blame any country for not doing its duty, because there is no obligations and there are no duties which are specifically set down. And I repeat, pan-Arabism, although is a very good idea for a foundation, does not on its own give rise to such duties and obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sindhi. And now the panel will accept questions. I'd be grateful if the questions could be phrased succinctly. And we have to end this discussion at 8:30. And I'd be grateful if the people who ask questions, restrict themselves to questions rather than statements, so that we can have as many questions as possible. If you'd like to address the question to a specific panelist, please indicate that.
Okay. Ms. Al-Nashif, I'm very concerned about the Palestinians who are living in Kuwait and what sort of a backlash they're going to be facing. And I think this is an issue that people really need to concentrate on. I'm wondering if you have any insights to that.
Unfortunately, we don't have much news at the moment about what exactly is happening. I understand from Jordan that the PLO has received assurances from the Kuwaiti government that the citizens who are living in Kuwait, whatever nationality, will be guaranteed security at base. I've heard since then from Kuwaiti sources that there's actually a split between the Kuwaiti population itself. Obviously, if you've heard any of the resistance who are now there are many people who who fought with the resistance, actually. The Crown Prince puts it down to 10% fought with the resistance, 10% collaborated with the Iraqi forces, and 80% were pretty much neutral. Unfortunately, it's the people who are coming in from outside who have been nursing their resentment for quite some time now and feeding off, unfortunately, a series of gross rumors. We hope that the presence of foreign troops, ironically enough, is going to give them protection at the moment, and we're waiting to see what's going to happen.
Thank you.
Actually, the best way I can say what I want to say is by making a comment, but since I can't, I'll have to put it in a form of a question the best way I can. I'm here in the business of disputing Mr. Mufti's representation of the Jordanian position. And this is the question. This is the question. This is an introduction to the question. This is the question. Mr. Mufti, don't you think that your representation of the Jordanian position actually reflects your own ideological standpoint? I mean, the representation issue is a very intricate issue, whereby when on your own political agenda, the worst thing that could have happened to the Arab world is somebody like Saddam Hussein, and the American presence is merely a fact to be dealt with according to state interest, and therefore the Jordanian public position becomes rather anomalous, whereas if one reversed the political agenda and so American presence is imperialism, then the Jordanian position becomes much more understandable.
Some question.
Well, I'm not sure how to address the question other than to say that, yes, my position is ideological in the sense that we all have values, and these values shape our opinions. And I try to distinguish between the state level, the street level, the intellectual levels, and I hope I was clear that there are these variations. If you're asking my opinion, my ideological agenda, I would agree entirely that I value the freedom and the democracies in our countries much more highly than the kind of obsession with so-called conspiracies and imperialist designs that has kept us back for so many years. I think we become strong not by tanks and chemicals, which are only good at using against our own people, but we become strong by becoming ourselves honest and ourselves free and ourselves democratic.
Any more questions, please?
My question is directed to Mr. Sindhi. Given the fact that there are no such things as public opinion polls or a free and dynamic press in Saudi Arabia, what instruments do you use to gauge the direction and level of Saudi public opinion with respect to the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia?
Obviously, that is one of the faults of the Saudi system. We are hopefully, would work towards, we have the problem of freedom of press, we have several problems. However, in gauging public opinion, you only have to see, obviously this is my own impression of the Saudi public opinion. My own impression has been through going to different mosques in Saudi Arabia, through speaking to different people, and through the different the levels of criticism that have been going on in Saudi Arabia, and by Saudi nationals who look at, this is specifically addressed in response to the Gulf War, who look at Iraq as a country which has the second largest sources of oil in the region, and with and the population isn't exactly that much larger, and they see what under Saudi rule what has been achieved in terms of a society, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the standards of living, and the standards of living and the infrastructure of the Iraqi government.
Any more questions?
Yes, I have a question. I was wondering if the panel could address the issues that are being debated about what happens now and what they feel about the presence of Saddam Hussein in Iraq still. Will that have a tremendous effect on the development of international relations in the region? Do they have personal opinions about whether means should be taken to oppose him or have him ejected from power, or what do they feel about the role the United States should play in the region now? I know I should address it to a particular panel member, but I think I'm just going to leave it open.
Actually, you have two questions there. One about Saddam and one about the role of the United States.
Actually, I guess it would be two questions.
So
that's okay.
Should we start with the first one?
Yeah, if you that would be fine.
Who would like to address this?
I can do it. As to Saddam being still in power, it's. I would have said it's almost ironic, except that unfortunately a lot of people kind of have foreseen it, in the sense that Iraq is destroyed. Iraq as a player in the region is destroyed, but Saddam is there in order to justify any, let's say, setup which would be any military setup or any political setup that would be not totally independent, in the sense that sort of the presence of maybe foreign forces or military agreements, etc. As to the internal situation, meaning what is Iraq with Saddam today, in a certain sense it seems at this stage that ironically, again, Saddam is Iraq's stability, or whatever is left of Iraq's stability. In the sense, imagine Iraq without Saddam today. Iraq is in chaos already. But without a central power to try to maintain it, maybe we'll end up with another Lebanon. So.
Would anybody else like to?
Can I also say that it's been a reflection of the short-sightedness of U.S.-American or American foreign policy in the region, that they're now stopping to ask the question, what after Saddam, because of the fears of the growing, vocalness, I suppose, if there is such a word, of the Kurdish and the Shiite minorities who are now threatening even more to emerge as a strong power, especially with the bigger threat of Iran sitting on the side. And I think this is the context that the problem has been posed now, certainly in this country. Sure, we don't want Saddam there, but do we want these people there instead? And this is going to be what we have to watch out for. These minorities have not asked for secession, and they're not presenting a threat to the intactness of Iraq so far. They're asking for a federalist structure. We've heard some American threats about bombing, continue to bomb Iraq if chemicals are used against these minorities, and yet I wonder whether it is in the interest of the United States to actually promote the kind of democratization that would lead to a more dangerous ally and a looming neighbor that is even more threatening than Saddam in the long term. That's what we have to watch.
There was this other question about U.S. role. Would anyone like to address that? I mean, you have touched on it. Yes, go ahead.
With respect to the U.S. Role at the moment, I would refer to something that I would have said in my presentation had I had more time.
Now you have.
Which is that, as I mentioned, there are two components to the various positions of the Gulf regarding the Gulf War among the Egyptian opposition parties. The question of the invasion of Kuwait, and the other being the presence of Western troops. Now, with parallel to these two components, there are two sets of double standard that are used as the nemesis, what is argued against. The first one being the American double standard, which Nada referred to, the American double standard in the region being pressing for implementation of UN resolutions from Iraq, but not as vehemently from Israel. This is one double standard. The other one, which is in the Egyptian case, is more highlighted, again, just as like the atrocities and the invasion being more highlighted, is the double standard within the Arab world of promoting the cause of Palestinians while at the same time sort of condoning the loss of sovereignty for the Kuwaitis. And with Kuwait being liberated at the moment, the double standard that remains in the Egyptian public opinion is the one about the U.S. and the Western role, and at the moment this seems to be a crucial key to what will happen in the future with respect to how people will actually consolidate this experience, how it will go down in Egyptian history as whether the war is actually popular in hindsight or not. I would say there are promising signs, but I would be cautious. Promising signs from the Bush speech, the Baker commitment to actually try to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict in some way, creating a linkage which was initially rejected but was ultimately expected to happen. So that's what I would say.
Any more questions?
I have a question for Ms. Al-Nashif about the PLO. The U.S. press conveyed, at least to me, that Arafat and the PLO were supporters, allies of Saddam Hussein. But you said that the PLO criticized the invasion of Kuwait, but wanted to preserve some sort of a middleman position. So now I feel somewhat confused. Could you explain in more detail what the position of the PLO actually was and is, and how do you think the whole situation will impact the PLO?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I can understand the source of confusion. The PLO, the official position was on the third day of the invasion, several members of the PNC, the National Council, actually condemned the invasion and asked for Iraqi withdrawal. The position that was then much more publicized was the refusal of Palestine or the PLO to actually join in a collective condemnation of the Iraqi situation. And that abstention was a very calculated move, I believe, by the Palestinians to actually retain some sense of detachment. Their argument was that if we collectively condemn Iraq, we give Saddam Hussein no way out, and that someone should stay in the ring to provide the link with the outside world. It is arguable how long they could have stayed completely neutral. Once the United States and Israel entered into the equation, I think it was inevitable that they would have to follow the mandate of popular will, certainly in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the territories were very, very outspoken in their support of Saddam Hussein. Again, I say, not per se, but as a symbol of a defiance that is long overdue from the Arab nations towards Israeli intransigence in the area. Again, the double standard, we have been living in these conditions for several decades, no one pays any attention. The Kuwaitis have been out of a homeland for 6 months, not to minimize their suffering, but to highlight ours. This needs to be remedied. In a historical context, the PLO has been gradually driven into the arms of Saddam Hussein. The loss of bases in Jordan in 1970, then the lack of stability in Lebanon from Lebanese internal and external dynamic. In Tunisia, we were seen to be unsafe. We had leaders assassinated even before this January. At the same time, Saddam Hussein was courting Yasser Arafat very strongly, with promises of provision of supplies and troops and support money and bases and everything. And it was inevitable that Yasser Arafat would be drawn into that fray. For the future, there have been many arguments about why we should change our leadership. We have a parliament, the Palestine National Council, over 600 members. It is up to them now to meet and decide on the future of the PLO as a leadership position. Over half of those members, incidentally, are from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And if Israel is so concerned that those people should be given a vote, then they should allow them to leave the territories and go to the PNC meetings to vote, which is the proper forum for those decisions to be made. Until that time, the PLO remains our legitimate representative. We have no other voice. And we hope that we will continue to move in sync with the developments in the region.
I'd like to add one point here is that the position of the PLO is portrayed as being principled in its refusal to use force against Iraq, to force Iraq out of Kuwait. After all, the PLO was pressured to renounce the use of force to get Israel out of the territories. So why should the same PLO be expected to endorse the use of force in another case? You see, so I mean, their portrayal of the position is it's a principled position.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I have following up on the PLO questions. Yes. Do the other countries hope that the PLO leadership has changed to be able to carry out the Palestinian issue?
This is addressed to the other countries.
Other countries, I think. How do they feel about, would the PLO be more effective in the coming months if their leadership has changed?
Cindy, would you like to address that?
Yes. As to Saudi Arabia, and I would imagine that would be for the other Gulf countries, the Palestinian cause is still the issue or the obstacle to peace with Israel. As the PLO stands, they do not recognize the PLO as such, as a representative of the Palestinian people under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, because of the stance he took. Now, should there be a change of the leadership, but still under the guise or the term of PLO, maybe the situation might be different, but I would find it very surprising that any of the Gulf states would accept dealing with the PLO under the leadership of Yasser Arafat.
Would anybody else like to address this?
I imagine Jordan's position is that it will deal with whatever PLO there is, and the decision about who leads it is entirely up to the Palestinians.
We couldn't hear.
The decision about who will lead the PLO is entirely up to the Palestinians, and the Jordanians, I would imagine, are going to deal with whatever leadership emerges.
Yeah, I would say the same of Egypt also.
Could you speak louder, please?
I would say the same of Egypt.
Question? Right up here. Can I ask a question?
Yes. Are you up there? Where are you? Well, we'll exempt you from coming down.
Yeah. I've heard from people who I consider enlightened Israelis and Arabs that there is some sort of solution for peace in the Middle East involving two states. Now, this question is can any of you all imagine a scenario where such a peace is possible? And two, how can the U.S. most intelligently form its policy to implement any possible?
Panelists who would like to address?
Simply by having the Israel meaning the government of Israel and the PLO, sit down and talk. Very simple.
Oh, well, if I can say, I mean, since Fez, there has been a commitment on behalf of the Arab leaderships, including the PLO, to actually enter into bilateral negotiations with Israel. And I think that's as close as we're going to get to recognition. I mean, they weren't talking about ghosts. They were actually talking about negotiating with the State of Israel. That's a very, very compromised position for the PLO, certainly in terms of historically the complete rejection of any sort of compromise to a complete turnabout and saying we will accept a two-state solution. It's a partial solution, but it's the best we have at the moment. And I think the current, the new dispossession of Palestinians, the exit from the Gulf, is going to add pressure to that. We need a home base. It's obvious that as long as the Palestinians remain at the whim and mercy of other governments, some carrying travel documents from Syria, some from Egypt, some from Lebanon, some from Jordan, there's not going to be peace in the Middle East.
I'm hearing the same old things. I guess what I'm looking for is something really, far-fetched, because there's a U.S. presence almost as a given in the region through Israel. And most of your perspectives I've heard behind them is that U.S. presence is making Israel be able to maintain an impossible stance. But what does Israel want that would be reasonable? That, like, the U.S. could bring about conditions within Israel to let a more moderate regime.
What, do the same as they did in Iraq, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, because we seem to be everywhere, and that's no big secret.
I think that would set a dangerous precedent, actually. I'm not sure what we can do inside Israel. I think there is enough consensus inside Israel on the need to find a peaceful solution to the problem. Enough people are fed up with this war that they are willing to settle, I would believe. And it's a question of bringing the government down, perhaps by veiled coercion from the United States, the same as they have been using with the whole of the Arab world, to say this is a unique opportunity. Let's push for disarmament in the region. Let's push for an open negotiation. Let's push for the inclusion of all parties. I don't know anything. I mean, that will be miraculous enough. I don't know what you're looking for. It's feasible.
Any more questions?
Well, the question about whether the Palestinian nation would be better served under other leadership than that of Yasser Arafat got asked to a number of people, but not to Ms. Al-Nashif, so I wanted to redirect the question to her.
I think she did answer. She said the PNC is going to meet.
I was asking for her own opinion, though.
You mean, you want me to name people who would be substitutes for Yasser Arafat? I don't think that's in my capacity. I think we have a number of highly qualified potential leaders, both in the West Bank and in the organization of the PNC, who would be willing to step up and take it. As I say, it's an internal decision. I hope that Mr. Arafat will call a meeting of the PNC soon, and I hope that, depending on the referendum, the vote of confidence or lack thereof that he is given at that meeting, we will decide who will be the new chairman.
Yes, please.
Yes, two questions. First, it seems to me, this is for Ms. Al-Nashif. I don't mean to pick on you. There are two questions. First, from 1948 to 1967, the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. Why wasn't there a Palestinian state formed at that time in those 13 years, or the 19 years that Jordan had control of the West Bank? And the second question is, it seems to me that the Palestinian movement has lost the objective for what they really want. They want a Palestinian state. Israel has said adamantly it considers the PLO to be a terrorist organization.
Can I have a question, please?
Yes, I'm getting to my point. The point is that there are people in the West Bank who they want to speak to, but the PLO wants to. You want the PLO to represent you. It seems to be that Israel has the West Bank right now. It's had it since 1967. They refuse to talk to the PLO. You've missed the objective. Your objective is you want a Palestinian state. Why don't you elect people in the West Bank to sit down and talk with Israel it seems like you would achieve your objective a lot more quickly than having the PLO that Israel adamantly will not talk to.
So the first question is, why
wasn't
did
there a Palestinian state formed from 1948 to 1967?
Why was no Palestinian state formed between 48 and 67?
Correct.
And the second question is would it not be in Palestinian interest to have elections in the occupied territories as a prelude to the realization of their political aspirations?
Yes. It seems like you've missed your objective is to have a Palestinian state, and you seem to be making an issue of the PLO being the
So you're saying that you would pick for us, or you would have the Israeli government pick for us the negotiators who will help us arrive at a settlement in the region. Is this your formulation?
If you're asking me the question, no. I'm saying to you, you're asking me the question. I'm saying no. Elect your own people in the area where they live.
But make sure they're people that you agree with.
Oh, non-PLO.
I don't understand.
Non-PLO.
Yeah, I'm sorry. If I seem very suspicious and skeptical, it's because I've heard this formulation. I'm trying to understand what exactly it is you're asking me. I've just said that we have a membership. Over half of the PNC membership comes from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Yes. Those people are as eligible as any to enter into elections. Under the auspices of the PNC, our parliament in exile, and stand for chairmanship if they should choose. I don't know where the interests of the Israeli government actually come into that. If you're asking me whether I would rather negotiate with Mr. Sharon or Mr. Shamir or Mr. Perez, I don't believe I have a choice. And I don't understand that the other side of the negotiating table should be setting conditions for who would negotiate for them. On the question of how close we are to achieving a Palestinian state, I think it is a question of perception. And I don't believe that by falling in with Israeli wishes, we will be closer. The settlement that we need is a fair and just one. We're not seeking for a magnanimous gesture from the State of Israel. And I think if you put that in perspective, then you understand that we must retain sovereignty and autonomy over that decision. Over your first question, again, there has been a change in perception. We lost the entire Palestine in 48. There was no conception that we needed to immediately create a substitute state in what is a very small part of what we originally lost in 48. Since then, the position of the PLO has moved radically to an acceptance of the status quo. We have realized that might is right, that Israel is there to stay, that we are now into second and third generations, that these people are not going to be removed, and that therefore, in the interest of the Palestinian populations in refugee camps, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and now again, escapees from the Gulf War, we need a homeland and we need a base. And therefore, the perception was not there before. We have gone through a very steady evolution, and Chairman Arafat, at the risk of greatly undermining his own personal political position within the PLO, actually acknowledged peace for land and two-state solution and all the rhetoric, including 242 and 338, that we never recognized before. So I think you should look at it as a progression forward, not as a regression to something that never was a possibility in the first place.
It's now 8:30, and I think we reached the end of this session. Thank you, all of you. Thank you.